History is written by the victors. Maybe that's true, but in part, more often, it's those who write history who become the victors. They rewrite it in advance, preparing the ground for decisive battles, inventing new facts that never existed, and erasing the memory of those who actually were. This is not an easy or simple task because you don't just have to make up some story. No, you have to build it in, sew it into reality. And you have to do this with maximum precision and care, like an organ transplant operation. And the more precisely the operation is performed, the longer the deception goes undetected. Or maybe never. But still, part of the knowledge about the replaced reality must be preserved. First, so as not to lose your own connection with it, and second, to remember how things really were. So that at some point you don't get confused and can skillfully insert a piece of the necessary truth where it needs to go. And that means it's simply necessary, a storage for such secrets. One of them is as well known to the whole world as the complete impossibility of getting inside. This is the Vatican and its Vatican Library. Nevertheless, sometimes miracles happen, and the doors there open for a short while. And at such moments, you can learn many new and interesting things we were never supposed to know. For example, the materials of the Inquisition, who was a righteous person, who was a heretic, and who was an arch-heretic. You are on the channel, The Age of Disbelief with Mikhail Kalmykov. And today we will try to sort out, perhaps, one of the most confusing and obscure cases of the Middle Ages, the case of Giordano Bruno. It would seem that from childhood, we have known that a young Catholic priest was publicly burned in Rome at the Square of Flowers. For what? But really, for what exactly? Everyone who went to school knows very well that he was burned for deciding to support Copernicus and declaring that the Earth revolves around the sun. Well, that is, those who study back in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. As for those who are studying now, perhaps they think he was burned for claiming that there are many worlds like Earth and that the universe is infinite. Even more advanced people think that he was subjected to a monstrous execution for claiming that Christ was an ordinary philosopher and magician and did not want to die. If you type the phrase, "Why was Giordano Bruno burned?" into a search engine, you'll get hundreds, if not thousands, of videos with the same title, and more or less the same information presented as if it's some great mystery. But still, the information there will be more or less the same as what I mentioned a little earlier. So it turns out to be some kind of strange secret, a Polichinelle secret that literally everyone knows about, but still with a persistence that deserves better use. They keep making videos and writing articles on this topic, literally pulling it out of thin air without saying anything new. So why did I get into this banality? The thing is, there are actually a lot more secrets here than it seems. Well, for example, right from the very first lines, they burned a young priest. After all, that's exactly the image that comes to our mind every time he's mentioned. Even the only engraving with his image, which has been reproduced all over the world, shows us a young man. But the medical fact is that when he was executed, he was already 52 years old. Of course, by today's standards, that's not even retirement age yet, but still, that's far from being a boy. And what I just said is something that, again, practically everyone knows. But because of media manipulation, the image of a young priest is still firmly stuck in people's minds. It might seem trivial. Fine. Let it be 52 years old. What's the big deal? But the thing is, it's from such seemingly insignificant little things that a big lie begins. A false image that comfortably settles in our minds and starts to influence our thoughts and actions. And that's why, no matter how boring or tedious it may seem, let's start figuring things out from the very beginning. Where do we even know about the existence of Giordano Bruno, about his life, about his biography? Well, probably there are manuscripts, his books, followers that have remained. Again, a monument to him was erected in Rome, right on the spot where he was burned. There must be some mentions of him in the literature of those years. Yes, there should be. But as they say, there's a nuance. First of all the books by Giordano Bruno were immediately added to the list of forbidden literature after his execution, and obviously were seized and destroyed at the first opportunity. They were on this list right up until 1948. That is, the following picture emerges. At the time of Giordano's imprisonment, his books were not particularly popular. After all, at that time there was a split in the church in Europe, and a huge number of branches were emerging, such as Lutherans, Calvinists, and other Protestants. The world was filled with heretical sentiments of all kinds, and the appearance of yet another movement didn't really change anything. Then all his books were instantly put on the list of banned literature and confiscated. Of course, some people still kept them, but secretly without advertising it, since his works were disliked not only by Catholics, but also by Lutherans and Calvinists. So there shouldn't have been any distribution of this literature. An ordinary person could only find out about the existence of these books, perhaps, by reading that very list of banned literature, where among a huge number of authors, yet another little-known name would appear. And only in 1948, that is, 3 years after the end of World War II, was his name removed from that list. And this means that neither the name Giordano Bruno, nor his fate, nor his books were widely known until 1948. And indeed, the first serious and major mentions of him in Russian-language literature come from the works of the bibliographer Alexander Kaimovich Garfunkel, who also translated the declassified materials into Russian. He was also one of the first to seriously study the history of Giordano Bruno. In fact, practically everything we know about Giordano now comes directly from quotes from Garfunkel's books. Apparently, he had direct access to the manuscripts. But in any case, it's almost impossible to find them in digital form now, which means I can't avoid this either. Quoting Garfunkel, "In many ways, we have to take Mr. Garfunkel at his word, although not only him, but that's already quite a lot." So, in 1948, the books of Giordano Bruno were removed from the list of prohibited literature. And obviously not without the help of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which had won the war against fascism and gained temporary authority over the defeated countries, including Italy and therefore the Vatican. But this was not the only and not the first case when the Vatican archives and secret materials became accessible to the public for a short time. The very first acquaintance of the world with Giordano Bruno happened exactly 100 years before this. From the year 1600 and for the next 250 years, his name was shrouded in oblivion, you could say, in a curse. Damnatio Memoria from the Notes of Garfunkel. Materials from the Venetian and Roman Inquisition archives were available to researchers. Taking advantage of this, apologists for the Catholic Church tried to deny even the very fact of the burning of the great thinker. In the year 1885, a book by T was published, Die Due Tragic Legend of a Giordano Bruno, whose author claimed that only an image of Bruno was burned, and he himself ended his days in a Dominican monastery. That is, until 1849, it was believed that they had burned his image or effigy. This is an important nuance to remember. But in 1848 in Lombardy and Venice, which at that time were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a liberal democratic revolution broke out. And although it was suppressed that same year, the revolution spread to Italy, where the uprising reached Rome and Florence. Pope Pius fled Rome, and the Vatican archives became temporarily accessible. Thus, The protocols of Giordano Bruno's interrogations in Venice became known, as well as the materials regarding Bruno's extradition to Rome and some of the verdicts of the Roman Inquisition in Bruno's case. Just a year later, the uprising was suppressed, but by then nothing could prevent the disclosure of the secret materials obtained in the Vatican. From 1867 to 1889, the main cases of the Inquisition were published, and in 1925, an additional 26 decrees of the Roman Inquisition were published. However, they did not concern the proceedings against Giordano Bruno. The documents that were obtained did not allow for a reliable reconstruction of the course of the trial. The investigation into the case of Giordano Bruno in Rome was reflected only in incomplete and extremely brief rulings of the Inquisition. But the main thing that was established is that it was not a dummy that was burned, but Giordano himself. It was from this moment that the information about Bruno being burned alive began to spread. But that's all. The information that quickly appeared as a result of the revolution was just as quickly hidden again. The next appearance of any information about this case happened 37 years later. And again, as soon as they appeared, they were classified. Here is what Alexander Garfunkel writes about this. In May-June of 1886, one of the keepers of the Vatican archive, Gregorio Palmieri, discovered a manuscript containing materials from the trial of Giordano Bruno, to which Pope Leo ordered that even the very fact of its discovery be kept in the strictest secrecy. The manuscript was placed under the personal control of the Pope, and no information about it leaked beyond the walls of the papal chancery. Thus, the most valuable archival documents about the great Italian philosopher were once again hidden from science. It was only in 1925 that the story of this discovery became known to the Vatican archivist Angelo Mercati, who only in 1940 found it among the materials of Pope Pius's personal archive. That is, only 39 years later did information become known that the discovery had even taken place. And for another 15 years, these manuscripts were purposefully searched for, and only then were they found. The manuscript was a collection of materials from the Inquisition. Among them were various kinds of records, information about heretics and heretical books, and about the Inquisition's trials. Of particular interest were 59 pages containing a brief summary of the investigation case of Giordano Bruno. This most important document was published by Angelo Mercati in 1942. It should be noted that its publication had purposes quite far from the pursuit of truth. Catholic historians seek to use this publication to prove the legitimacy of the process, the lawfulness of the execution of Giordano Bruno, and to prove his guilt. The apologists in the Catholic Church were attracted by the accusation against Bruno in the newly discovered document of apostasy, of speaking out against the dogmas of religion and church rituals. So what exactly did Angelo Mercati discover? And what he discovered was nothing other than the stenographic records of the interrogations of Giordano Bruno. The Inquisition in the period from 1592 to 1598, that's what they were called. A brief summary of the investigation file of Giordano Bruno. It was a priceless gift to society, since absolutely everything we know now about Giordano, starting from his first name, year and place of birth, the names and circumstances of Donoso, and much, much more. All of this we know from this very record of the investigation materials. Much later, correspondence between the Roman and Venetian Inquisitions and the text of the sentence of the Roman tribunal were added to all this. It should be noted that in the period between the first discovery in 1849 and the second in 1886, some works of Giordano were published. Apparently, these were the exact ones stolen by revolutionaries from the Vatican Library. One of these manuscripts was purchased by the Russian book lover and statesman Nora. It was an entire collection of handwritten treatises, including some on magic with drawings, written in the philosopher's own hand. It was given the name the Moscow Codex. Unfortunately, Giordano's handwriting was classic medical style, illegible. Apparently for that reason, or maybe for some other reason, a few years later, he handed this manuscript over to the Rumyantsev Museum, from which the manuscript, eventually ended up in the Russian State Library. By the way, it was the Moscow Codex that formed the basis of the complete collected works of Giordano Bruno, published by a Parisian publishing house. It is also known that in 1950, Boris Zubov, based on the manuscript, wrote an article titled The Manuscript Legacy of Giordano Bruno, the Moscow Codex of the State Library of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, named after Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Thus, when studying the work of Giordano Bruno, we must constantly remember that almost all known information about him appeared suddenly in the mid-19th and early 20th centuries. The circumstances of the appearance of these materials are quite unusual. And if it is possible to believe that the documents were stolen from the Vatican Library by revolutionaries, then their subsequent repeated discoveries directly by Vatican archivists already seem suspicious. Well, for example, how did it happen that Mercati started digging around in the personal archive of Pope Pius? Who allowed him to rummage through the belongings of the late Pope, and why? Why, when the materials were found, did the archivist not show them, first and foremost, to the then Pope of Rome, Pius? And if he did show them, then why didn't the new Pope seize these documents again, but instead allowed them to be published? Besides, let's not forget that these materials appeared in the midst of World War II, when fascism was raging in Italy, and Mussolini. So there is a high probability that at that moment the documents that were found were ideologically beneficial to the Church. As Garfunkel himself says, Catholic historians tend to use this publication to prove the legitimacy of the process, the lawfulness of the execution of Giordano Bruno, to prove his guilt. In Russia, or more precisely, in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, these materials were also given an ideological coloring. Indeed, it was very convenient in 1948, 3 years after the end of World War II, to present the symbol of the martyr's death of a progressive reformer at the hands of the Catholic Inquisition. Thus, it turns out that the documents about the burning of the heretic were first beneficial to the Fascist Party of Italy, which used them to justify its actions, and after the war, on the contrary, to the victorious forces represented by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. At the same time, although Garfunkel says that Catholic priests were not interested in establishing the truth, but rather in setting an example. But to be fair, it must be said that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics acted in exactly the same way. It is not hard to notice that, starting right from the very beginning of the investigation, that is, from the end of the 16th century, this entire case was thoroughly permeated with ideological necessities. Even then, the final verdict, the sentence announced in the square before the execution, stated that the accusation had delivered a verdict on 8 counts, but only 1 was made public. And even that was all presented as a conversation with Giordano himself, like, you know what we're talking about? And that's why you will be burned. And the rest of the people in the square were not supposed to know about it. Over time, from the materials of the investigation and Giordano's interrogations, we learned part of the accusations, but only a small part. More precisely, from the brief summary of the investigation file compiled by the Inquisition back in 1598. A brief, not a complete one. That's exactly why we still don't know the real reason why he was actually burned. No matter what anyone says during the investigation, the points of the sentence were not announced. And that's a medical fact. And that's why all assumptions about the true motives will remain just assumptions in any case, including mine. However, looking at the strange manipulations surrounding this mysterious case, I assume that the real reason why Giordano was executed posed a danger not only to the Inquisition of those times, but also to the modern church of any denomination, and even to any representatives of power, both capitalist and Soviet to this day. So let's read more carefully what exactly Giordano said at the trial. Case materials, documents of the Venetian Inquisition, the first interrogation on May 26, 1592. Chairman Alozzi Foscari, present were Lodovico Taberno, Apostolic Nuncio Lorenzo Priuli, Patriarch of Venice Gabriele Saluzzi, Magistrate Inquisitor. In the presence of the aforementioned persons, a man of average height with a chestnut beard, appearing to be about 40 years old, was brought in. He was offered to take an oath. He took the oath, placing his hands on the gospel, and said, "I will tell the truth. Many times I was threatened to be brought before the court of this holy service, but I always considered it a joke, for I am ready to give an account of myself. Last year when I was in Frankfurt, I received 2 letters from Signor Giovanni Mocenigo, a Venetian nobleman. In them he extended an invitation to come to Venice, wishing, as he wrote, for me to teach him the arts of memory and invention. He promised me a warm welcome and assured me that I would be well rewarded. I arrived 7 or 8 months ago. I taught him various concepts related to these 2 sciences. At first, I didn't settle in his house, but then I moved into his own house. After making sure that I had fulfilled my obligations and taught him everything he required from me, I decided to return to Frankfurt to publish some of my works. And last Thursday, I asked him for permission to leave. When he found out about this, Signor Mocenigo suspected that I wanted to leave his house, to teach other people the same knowledge that I taught him and others, and not at all to go to Frankfurt. As I said, he did everything he could to keep me. When I firmly insisted on my desire to leave, he first began to complain that I had not taught him everything I had promised. And then he began to threaten me, saying that if I did not wish to stay voluntarily, he would find a way to keep me. The next day was Friday. Signor Giovanni, seeing that I insisted on my decision to leave, had already given instructions regarding his affairs and prepared his things to be sent to Frankfurt. At night, he came to me when I was already in bed, under the pretext that he wanted to talk to me. When he entered, his servant by the name of Bartola was with him, along with 5 or 6, as I suppose, gondoliers who lived nearby. He made me get out of bed and took me to the attic. There, they locked me up. Moreover, Giovanni stated that he intended to detain me and to make me teach him concepts related to memorizing words as well as concepts of geometry, skills he had been striving for from the very beginning, and then to grant me my freedom. Otherwise, I am threatened with serious trouble. In response to this, I continued to insist that, in my opinion, I had taught him enough, and even more than I was obliged to, and did not deserve such treatment. He left me locked up until the next day. Then Captain appeared with several people unknown to me and ordered them to take me down to an underground room. There, I was left until night. After that, another captain appeared and took me to the prison of the Holy Service. I am convinced that I was imprisoned through the efforts of a certain Giovanni. He bore a grudge for the reasons mentioned above and apparently made some kind of report against me. Next, the defendant was asked what name was given to him at baptism, what his surname was, what class or whose son he was, where he was from, what nationality he was, and what profession he and his father had. I answered, "My name is Giordano from the Bruni family, from the city of Nola, located 12 miles from Naples. I was born and raised in this city. My occupations are literature and all the sciences. My father's name is Giovanni. My mother's name is Fralisa Savallina. My father was a soldier by profession. He and my mother have already passed away. My age is about 44 years. I was born, as I know from my relatives, in the year 1948. I studied literature, logic, and dialectics in Naples until the age of 14, and also attended public lectures by a certain person who called himself a native of Salerno and took private lessons in logic from Father Augustinian named Teofilo da Verona, who later taught metaphysics in Rome. At the age of 14 or 15, I became a novice in the Dominican order at the monastery of St. Dominic in Naples. I was accepted by the then prior of the monastery, Master Ambrosio Pasqua. After a year of novitiate, I was admitted to monastic vows, and, as far as I remember, only one other novice took the vows with me. Then in due time, I was ordained as a priest and celebrated my first Mass in company in a city of the same kingdom of Naples, quite far from Naples itself. And I stayed there in the monastery of the same order, dedicated to Saint Bartholomew, remaining in the same Dominican order where I had received my ordination. I performed Mass and other services until the year 1976, being under the obedience of the superiors of this order and the abbots of the monastery. In the year 1976, the year following the Jubilee year, I was in Rome at the Dalla Minerva Monastery, under the obedience of Magister Sista de Luca, the procurator of the order. I arrived to present my justification, as I had twice been brought to trial in Neapol. The first time was for throwing away images and icons of saints and keeping only the crucifix, and for this I was accused of contempt for the images of the saints. And the second time was for telling an obedient who was reading the history of the seven joys in verse, "What benefit can this book bring him?" And let him throw it all away and instead read some other book, for example, the Lives of the Holy Fathers. At the time when I arrived in Rome, this case was resumed in connection with other accusations, the content of which is unknown to me. As a result, I left the clergy, took off my monastic robe, and went to Noli in the Genoese region. There I spent 4 or 5 months teaching grammar to young people. This concludes the first interrogation. I have deliberately read it to you in full, without any omissions, so that it becomes completely clear where we actually know so much about Giordano Bruno from. These are practically complete quotations from the interrogations of the Venetian Inquisition, compiled in the year 1598. The second interrogation was exactly the same. Giordano continued to recount his life in the smallest details. Moreover, contradictions arise right from the very beginning. For example, the very first thing Giordano was asked under oath was what name he was given at baptism. In other words, what his real name was. And he answered that his name was Giordano. Once again, under oath, his name is Giordano. However, if you open Wikipedia, it says that his name was Philippa, and then he changed it to Giordano. Where does Wikipedia get this information from? But during the Roman interrogations there, in Rome, for some reason he changed his testimony and started calling himself Philippa. But in fact, we don't have the Roman interrogations themselves. The only thing we have are references to them in the margins of the brief summary. That is, we know that there were a total of 17 interrogations, 7 of which took place in Venice. There where he was captured, they took place during the first year of his imprisonment. We know their content from that very brief summary. The remaining 10 interrogations took place in Rome over the following 7 years. And about them, we know nothing except for these very notes in the margins and references to them. Another inconsistency in the premises. Before the arrest, at the first interrogation, Giordano says that Giovanni Mocenigo sent him 2 letters asking him to teach him. And according to Giordano, he was in Frankfurt at that time, from where he came to teach and where he was planning to return. But in the correspondence between the Inquisitions, we learn that at the time before arriving at Mocenigo's, Giordano Bruno was living in Geneva. And again, this information pertains to the Roman interrogations. Another inconsistency lies in the amount of time Giordano spent in prison. Yes, it's not hard to calculate that if he was captured in 1592 and burned in 1600, he spent 8 years in prison. However, the final sentence states that he spent 12 years in prison and escaped after the first 4 years of imprisonment. But we don't know anything about these periods. In any case, the story is rather murky. Yes, Giordano himself admits that denunciations against him began when he was still serving in the monastic order, but at the same time, he never says that he was ever imprisoned for it. Other researchers have naturally noticed this inconsistency as well. For example, our Alexander Garfunkel. And what did they do? They correctly noted in the field that this statement is mistaken and that the Inquisition simply made an error. Or maybe not. And again, that murky aftertaste. On the one hand, we have no idea what happened to Giordano in the Roman prison for 8 years, but at the same time, we confidently say that the Inquisition was mistaken about something. By the way, many researchers who had access to the original sources, for example, even Garfunkel, note that the records of the trial show all the signs of corrections and forgery. That is, they were definitely altered. The only question is, where exactly and for what purpose? Here's another interesting nuance. As you remember, at the very beginning I mentioned that the first Vatican archives became accessible when revolutionaries in Italy occupied Rome and the Vatican in 1849. Naturally, some things were taken from there and ended up in the archives of wealthy and influential people, so that decades later they could be sold. For example, that's how the Moscow Codex ended up in Russia. So, one of the participants in that very uprising was a certain Giuseppe Mazzoni. Since childhood, he had been preparing himself for political activity, and by the time of the uprising, he had gained such strength and influence that he became one of the 3 leaders of the provisional government of Italy. That's customary there. For example, Gaius Julius Caesar was not initially the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, but shared power with Gnaeus Pompeius and Marcus Crassus. This was the triumvirate. And this newly emerged Caesar, Giuseppe Mazzoni, was one of those who personally broke into the Vatican archives. More than 20 years later, he sent part of the Inquisition materials to the Minister of Agriculture, Industry, and Commerce of the Kingdom of Italy, Domenico Berti, who published them in one of his works in 1876. So, this is what Giuseppe Mazzoni writes in his accompanying letter to Domenico Berti. The decrees were copied by me in 1849 in the archives of the Roman Inquisition from the Infoglio volume, on paper, bound in parchment, and with the inscription on the spine, Decrees of the Holy Office, 1619. And on a slip of paper attached to the spine, it says 55,100. This volume belongs to a later period. Judging by the handwriting, I think it dates to the second half of the 18th century. In many places, the copyists could not make out the handwriting of the originals, which I searched for in vain, and which, perhaps, were partly damaged by ink, leading to the necessity of copying them. Instead of making arbitrary substitutions of words, the copyists often preferred to use ellipses, sometimes filled in with other handwriting. That is, there is no need for any conspiracy theory here at all. It is stated openly that Mazzoni copied, that is, rewrote the contents of Thomas, who in turn was also a copyist of an earlier one. At the same time, the early Vatican copyists did not understand part of the text and not only copied it incorrectly, but also accidentally damaged it with ink. And these documents are the order of Pope Clement on the transfer of Giordano Bruno to the secular authorities for execution, the text of the sentence, the verdict on the prohibition of Giordano Bruno's books, the church ritual, the curse of Giordano Bruno, the transfer of Giordano Bruno into the hands of the civil authorities for burning. The message about the upcoming burning of Giordano Bruno, the notice of the burning of Giordano Bruno, the message from Giordano Bruno's student Ventimiglia about his burning, the report of the Brotherhood about the beheading of John the Baptist. That is literally the most important documents about the last days of Giordano Bruno were incorrectly copied, corrected, blotted with ink, and copied again. Another question arises: why did Mazzone simply take out some books and then resell them to a Russian patron? But he copied and duplicated the documents about the trial and sentence of Giordano Bruno. Why, after suppressing the uprising, did the returning Pope Pius simply not execute him, even though during Pius' reign 133 people were executed? But this did not apply to Mazzone. Moreover, Mazzone was later, after the revolution and 10 years of exile, appointed as a senator. And before that, in 1870, he was elected Grand Master of the Grand Orient of Italy. This is a Masonic lodge, but he didn't stop there, and later founded his own Masonic lodge, Propaganda Masonica. It was this kind of man who brought us the first documents from Giordano Bruno. Somehow I can't shake the feeling that we're witnessing some kind of performance. Of course, I won't torture you by reading all 7 Venetian interrogations. After all, this information is public. You just need to enter a query in any search engine and you'll get the full text. However, I would like to draw your attention to one more phrase from Giordano's 3rd interrogation. They asked whether the printed books were actually published in the cities and countries indicated on them or elsewhere. He replied, all the books that are marked as printed in Venice were actually published in England. The indication that they were printed in Venice was made at the publisher's request, so that they would be easier to sell and would gain wider distribution. Because if it had been indicated that they were published in England, it would have been much more difficult to sell them here. Almost all the rest were published in England, even if they are marked as being from Paris or other places. That is, in other words, absolutely all the books of Jordan that he published were printed in England, and the publishers deliberately put the stamp of publishing houses from Venice, Paris, Frankfurt, and others on them. On the one hand, this is a minor detail that can be quite logically explained by the publisher's desire to sell the book faster and make a profit. However, it fundamentally changes our entire understanding of almost all printed editions from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries that have survived to our days. But even this single piece of evidence at the Inquisition trial puts a big question mark over the date and place of publication of absolutely any book from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. From this moment on, we know nothing about who published any books in the Middle Ages. More precisely, we know that the largest printing house in Europe was England, which deliberately falsified the places of publication of various books. And this is no longer conspiracy theory, but a medical fact, if we believe Giordano's interrogation text. Another myth is that he was burned thanks to the denunciation of Giovanni Mocenigo. The thing is, Mocenigo really did treat Giordano, as it's fashionable to say now, without any limits. That is, he invited him as a guest, and then literally took him hostage, locked him in the basement, wrote a denunciation, and handed him over to the Inquisition. That's a fact. But it is also a fact that Giordano easily refuted his denunciations in the Venetian court. And the worst that threatened him was being sent back to the monastery. In fact, in the Venetian court, he answered very logically, thoughtfully, and reasonably. His speech was clear and easy to understand. And the Venetian Inquisition was already inclined to release him. However, 2 factors intervened. The Roman Inquisition suddenly urgently demanded that the prisoner be transferred from Venice to Rome. Moreover, what served as the basis for this is completely unclear, since according to indirect evidence. It becomes clear to us that at that moment, the Roman Inquisition had not even read his books yet and had no idea who he was. Nevertheless, the Roman Inquisition immediately referred to him in a letter not just as a heretic, but as an arch-heretic, that is, the patriarch of heretics. So there was something about him that we don't know, and perhaps we'll never know. But what we do know for sure is that the Venetian Inquisition was not only going to release Giordano, but even dared to refuse the Roman Inquisition's request to hand him over. Although it didn't last long, and already in the next letter they gave in and arranged for the prisoner to be transferred to Rome. And already in Rome, the accusations against Giovanni Mocenigo were supplemented by denunciations from Giordano's cellmates. In particular, the Capuchin monk Celestino, Giordano's cellmate in Venice, and Francesco Graziano, also a cellmate, as well as someone named Ciotto Bertana and Matteo Zaga Giovanni. Antonio della Tonazzi Oragoni from Verona, a cleric and subdeacon of the Capuchin order, with a monastic name Brother Celestino from Verona. In the year 1587, he was under investigation by the Roman Inquisition on charges of heresy. He was in the same cell with Bruno in the Venetian prison from September 1592 until his extradition to the Roman Inquisition in February 1593. Francesco Graziano, originally from Udine, lived in Venice in the 1580s where he worked on translations, copying books, including those banned by the church, and giving private lessons. Judging by the witnesses' testimonies, he was an educated man. He argued with everyone. Everyone considered him eccentric, and no one trusted him. In 1584, he was arrested by the Venetian Inquisition and accused of heresy. He spoke out against the secular power of the Pope and the clergy's income, and denied the authenticity of the so-called donation of Constantine. After his recantation on April 4th, 1585, he was released, but was later arrested again as someone who had relapsed into heresy. He was in the same cell with Giordano Bruno in 1592 to 1593. On March 27, 1593, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was summoned to Rome to testify in the Bruno case and was interrogated twice at the end of 1593 and the beginning of 1594. Graziano's testimony surpassed other witnesses, Bruno's neighbors, concerning the cell where theological matters were discussed. Together with Mocenigo and Celestino's denunciations and testimonies, it gave the Inquisition the primary evidence against Bruno. In February 1598, Graziano was released from imprisonment. It is notable that all the cellmates were also convicted of heresy. In particular, Francesco Graziano was convicted twice. The first time he was released because he recanted his words, but then he was caught again and given a life sentence. That's how he became Giordano's cellmate. However, after his testimony at the trial in Rome, 2 years before Bruno's execution, he was suddenly and mercifully released. As lawyers would say today, this was clearly a deal with the investigation. Another cellmate, Matteo Zaga, did not give any serious testimony and, apparently for that reason, died in prison before the sentence was passed. The fate of the third cellmate, Brother Celestin, was also tragic. The investigation listened to his denunciations, attached them to the case, and then considered Celestine himself to be a medium and possessed, and executed him 6 months before Giordano's execution. Once again, one cellmate died mysteriously, the second was declared insane and executed. But at the same time, his testimony is part of the charges, and the third cellmate profitably sold his testimony and was released instead of serving a life sentence. Everything points to the fact that it was extremely important for Rome to destroy Giordano Bruno under any pretext, and from this follows a somewhat paradoxical conclusion. To understand the meaning of Bruno's execution, we don't actually need to read the records of the denunciations at all. After all, everything that is indicated there will, in any case, be either falsified or staged by the Inquisition. All those 8 points mentioned in the final accusation are simply empty formalities, just to somehow fill the senselessness of the sentence. That's why there was no point in reading them out loud. Well, here, take a look. It's often mentioned that Giordano claimed the earth revolves around the sun, and supposedly that's exactly why he was burned. But the truth is that these ideas were only declared heresy in the year 1616. Bruno couldn't have been executed for these words because by the time they were officially considered grounds for persecution, Giordano had already been dead for 16 years. Others believe that Giordano was burned for speaking about the plurality of worlds. However, Bruno justified this with quotes from Thomas Aquinas, who explicitly spoke about the plurality of worlds and who was canonized and whose teachings became the official philosophy of the Catholic Church. Suddenly, it turns out that the Catholic Church never considered this heresy. That is, the plurality of worlds has nothing to do with it, just like all the other accusations, which compared to the previous two, seem completely ridiculous. Therefore, all the interrogation protocols are just a distraction from the real true reasons, which can most likely be understood by reading his works. And since one of the most important books which is repeatedly mentioned in the accusation is The Banishment of the Triumphant Beast, let's take a look at what is actually written there. The Banishment of the Triumphant Beast. The first translation of this book into Russian was done by Alexei Zolotaryov in 1911. And right away from the very first lines we read that this work is dedicated to a certain Signor Philip Sidney. Moreover, the book begins with an explanatory letter to this very Philip Sidney, in which he thanks him and his friend, Signor Folk-Gravel, for their significant help with the work. For reference, Philip Sidney and Folk-Gravel were very influential British lords of that time. Philip Sidney commanded the British army in the Battle of Zutphen against Spain. He lost and died from his wounds. He wrote but did not finish the novel Arcadia. Folk-Gravel was the first Baron Brooks, the governor of the Principality of Wales, and later the Minister of Finance of Britain, a close friend of Philip Sidney. It is believed that Folke was deeply offended by the mockery of English life made by Bruno at his Great Lent dinner. And supposedly, that's why he apologized to Folke in this way. Supposedly because it's obvious that it was these gentlemen who provided their influential and financial support in publishing Jordan's books in England. Because publishing costs a lot of money, which Jordan had very little of. Moreover, in the letter, he clearly states that the reason for their mutual dislike is not mockery of the English way of life, but self-interest, specifically self-interest. Many consider the book The Banishment of the Triumphant Beast to be a kind of satire, or at least a humorous work. However, when I read it, I saw neither satire, nor jokes, nor humor. Well, except that one of the deities, who plays an important role in the book, was the god of jokes, mockery, and ridicule, a sort of analog to the Scandinavian god Loki or the Greek god Momus. I don't see any other reasons to consider this book a satire. The book itself is written in a very pretentious style, with such an enormous amount of unnecessary words that it creates a sense of some kind of meaningless cacophony, a verbal dump without any real idea. And that's why it's unbearably difficult to read it thoughtfully. Also in the explanatory letter, Jordan says, "Yes, no one with such an ugly soul or such a spiteful spirit would ever think of convincing themselves or others that everything written in this book was stated by me as a fact." That is, he is literally begging not to take this book seriously. But a couple of paragraphs later, he adds that every speech in the book's dialogues, every speech is filled with its own meaning. And then a few paragraphs later, he states, "Will you see serious or funny conversations? Remember that all of them should be viewed through special glasses in the same way." What kind of special glasses? In my opinion, he is directly hinting that what is written in the book, on the contrary, should be taken very seriously. And also, it seems, he is hinting at some encrypted messages in the text. Apparently, the Inquisitors understood this too, and that's why they ended up burning him. So, what is this book about? These are 3 dialogues, each divided into several parts. The setting is unclear, whether it's on Earth, in the sky, or in some kind of parallel space. It's not clear. One thing is clear. This is some kind of great council of gods under the leadership of Jupiter or Zeus, whichever you prefer. The conversation is being held by Greek and Roman gods. Sophia, that is, wisdom, Momus, the god of mockery, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and a certain mysterious Solon. Sophia tells Solon that Jupiter, that is, Zeus, is no longer the same as he used to be. He has grown old, become tired, and is preparing for death. At the same time, it turns out that each of the gods can reincarnate as anyone they wish, live and die a human life, and be reborn again and again as a human. To them, all of this is merely a game. That is, these gods do not have a permanent body. They are merely the embodiment of a certain energy, sometimes in one person, sometimes in another. But this very essence also has a beginning and an end. It too will perish, will die, just like everything else in the universe. And then it will be reborn again, but this will already be a different rebirth, a rebirth of the very essence itself. Jupiter knows about this, so he doesn't really worry, but he understands that with his departure, everything among the gods will change. And that's why he wants to leave something good, or at least something just behind after himself. And he convenes the Council of the Elder Gods. It's even called the Age of Zeus, 36,000 years. It's curious that the topic of the Trojan War keeps coming up at the council. Here and there, episodes from it are recalled as if it really was something important, though not the only one. Episodes from the Titanomachy and from the conflict with Prometheus are also recalled. As we know from Greek mythology, Momus, the god of mockery who used to ridicule the gods, was banished from Olympus, but now he is justified and called back to the council as a jester who can speak the truth directly to their faces. And so Jupiter gathers a great feast for all the gods, and at the end of the feast, unexpectedly for all of them, he announces the assembly of the council. He delivers a long speech about how this event is not spontaneous and how long he has been thinking about it, and then he begins to explain the main idea. That's when the readers start to have their minds blown. Jupiter, also known as Zeus, for some reason begins a long story about stars and constellations, where each constellation has its own character, properties, or threshold. And all these qualities are presented as if they are living beings: betrayal, slander, debauchery, corruption, anger, contempt, envy, malice, lust, greed, and so on and so on. They all seem to be some kind of animated entities, which in turn are part of the beast. Giordano calls it the triumphant beast because these qualities almost always prevail in a person, and they filled the entire sky, every constellation, every world. The point of this advice is precisely to drive all the pieces of this beast from the sky down to the earth, and to replace them with other pieces. The virtuous ones, that is, their opposites. Most of the book is the dullest and meticulous enumeration of all these qualities, where they are found, what they will be replaced with, and where they will be cast down. However, if you put on the special glasses mentioned in the preface, there is a filter that cuts out all the chaff, and you can find some very interesting messages and information. For example, there is a mention that in the recently discovered part of the world called the New World, that is, in modern America, chronicles will be found containing information about the history of the last 10,000 years and more. Remember, in the preface, Jordan emphasizes that each monologue is filled with its own separate meaning. In each monologue, there is encrypted information, possibly a prophecy, or perhaps even specific instructions. Another monologue in the book tells about Promethe, who wanted to humble God by saying that no, he did not steal fire for people. No, Promethe wanted to give people immortality, And it's Saturn, also known as Kronos, the father of Zeus, who talks about this, and he also happened to be at the council. He suggests leaving Hydra in the sky, that is, the serpent who helped neutralize Promethe, who, no, did not steal, but convinced Zeus to voluntarily fill several barrels with immortality and deliver them to people. And as a result, make people equal to the gods. During the journey, Hydra, the serpent, forced the donkey carrying these barrels to bend down to a water source, which caused the load to shift, fall off the donkey's back, and break. All the liquid was absorbed into the ground, but Hydra managed to collect a few drops for herself. That's why Hydra is now immortal. Another monologue, perhaps, tells about an unknown but interesting moment from the War of the Gods. If you watch my previous films, you remember that several years before the start of the Trojan War, Troy was captured by Heracles. And right after that, Gaia organized a sudden attack of the giants on Olympus with the goal of destroying all the gods. The gods themselves couldn't handle them. Only a mortal was capable of doing that. That's where Heracles went, but it turns out he wasn't alone. Someone was helping him, Capricorn. It's still unclear to me whom Giordano means by Capricorn, but it's definitely not Heracles, because at that same meeting, it was suddenly decided to expel Heracles from the heavens back to earth. And as consolation or a reward, he was once again assigned to become an earthly god, who would be valued more highly than a true celestial demigod. I wonder in what way. But we got distracted. This very same Khazarog distinguished himself in the Titanomachy, that is, the War of the Gods. It turned out that from the caves of Tavor, that is, from Crimea, a monster appeared, which went to defend Egypt from these very gods, that is, the Olympians. And this monster was so powerful that even the gods did not dare attack it. So this very same Khazarog advised the gods to turn into animals in order to sneak up on the monster. What did they do? But the inhabitants of Egypt saw the gods while they were still in the forms of animals, and that's why they began to worship them in exactly that appearance. Here's the exact quote. "What do you think, Father, should be done with this holy, immaculate, and honorable Capricorn, with this divine and wondrous milk brother of yours, with this brave and more than heroic companion of ours against the dangerous, sudden, and daring attack of the giants, with this great counselor in war who found a way to slay that very enemy who emerged from the caves of Taurus in Egypt as the most fearsome adversary of the gods? Who, for we did not dare to attack openly, he gave us the instruction to turn into beasts, so that by skill and cunning we could make up for the shortcomings of our nature and strength, and thus achieve a glorious triumph over our enemies. For it was he who made the Egyptians worship living images of beasts, and they began to worship us in the forms of animals." End of quote. This event is given several pages in the book, and it shows us the Egyptian pantheon of gods as a banal cargo cult. Moreover, it synchronizes well with my conclusions from previous episodes. For example, the sudden attack of the Olympians on Egypt, thanks to which Atlan ended up imprisoned in the dungeon. And also, this moment serves as new evidence of the strange military alliance between Egypt and Krim. If you remember, during the Trojan War, on the contrary, Egypt sent troops to help, as we now understand, the inhabitants of Priasovye and Krim. In this way, in the form of dialogues between gods, Giordano conveys some encrypted messages and new data. In one of the messages, some kind of numerical code is clearly traceable. Look here, in one of the dialogues, he recites a mathematical sequence that seems natural to him. He says that first it's all in 4s, then in 12s. Then it increases to 70, twice, and in 144. That is 4, 12, 70, 2, and 16. At first glance, this seems like a sequence, but what kind? The first number is multiplied by 4, the result is multiplied by 3, Then the result is multiplied by 6, and the next result by 2, 4, 3, 6, 2. What kind of sequence is this? It's not arithmetic, not geometric, and definitely not Fibonacci. And you might think it's just a random set of numbers. But in the preface to the book, Jordan clearly said, each paragraph is a separate, encrypted thought that should be viewed separately through glasses, that is, through a filter, to decipher. In addition, in this work, the gods seem to be pondering what to do with the constellations, which ones to make smaller, which ones to enlarge, which ones to move to the right or to the left, and which ones to leave in place. So what do you think you want? But in my opinion, this is a detailed description of some global cosmic processes, as a result of which the tilt of the Earth's axis changed. And because of that, the constellations change their positions and passive movement. Of course, all of this is in encrypted form. The book is literally full of such encrypted messages. And most likely they are still waiting for their future researchers. But suddenly the book ends. Zeus asks the gods if they agree with him. Everyone agrees and they go off to feast. Solon says, "Well, I'll go to my dinner," Sophia replies, "and I'll retire for nightly contemplation." Everyone, period. No morality, no exercise, no conclusion or inference, nothing. Just the report is finished, which once again suggests that this is not a literary work at all. So why was Jordan Bruno burned? What is in this book that enraged the inquisitors so much? The conversation seems to be only about ancient gods, but at the same time, the process of the rebirth of souls and reincarnation is mentioned very actively. Plus, some details of history are revealed that could be unpleasant for some people. For example, about the emergence in Egypt of the cult of gods with animal heads, about the Trojan War and the Titanomachy, and about the fact that gods are also mortal, and that a global cosmic cataclysm happened not so long ago. But the main thing is not even that. The thing is that Jordan, for some reason, was absolutely sure of his own inviolability and invulnerability, and acted as if he were a messenger of the gods, or at least one of them. The root of his movements partially coincides with the map of underground enclaves I talked about in the previous video. Rome, Geneva, Frankfurt, and Britain. But the time spent in each of the cities does not match. According to Jordan's own testimony, he stayed in Geneva for only 2 months and almost immediately after his arrival. He was contacted by Marquis de Vito, who immediately helped him get a job at a printing house and explained the rules for staying in Geneva. It turns out that Geneva had its own branch of Protestantism, emerging Calvinism, and a necessary condition for living in the city was mandatory acceptance of this faith. And although Giordano refused to accept it, he was still given a cloak, a hat, and a sword. In general, the century brought a split in the Catholic Church and the emergence of several parallel branches of Christianity at once, which are collectively referred to as Protestantism. However, it was not the only one. Lutheranism, which originated in Germany, was initially popular. Let's recall the Oldenburg Enclave. Closer to the end of the 16th century, Calvinism originated in Geneva, which also fits the Swiss enclave. That is, it creates the impression that the gods of these refugees joined the game and began to create their own religions based on Christianity. If you look at it from this point of view, it suggests the conclusion that Giordano Bruno was one of the messengers, avatars of yet another god or another religion. In fact, he never even hid it and spoke about it almost openly. Well, for example, in the epigraph to the book, The Expulsion of the Triumphant Beast, he, without any hesitation, writes that the content of this book is offered by Jupiter, fulfilled by Sovet, proclaimed by Mercury, narrated by Sophia, heard by Solon, and recorded by Melancthon. In this case, Nalansum refers to himself as Giordano Bruno. That is, he is openly saying that all of this was literally communicated to him by the gods, and he was entrusted with organizing yet another religion. Although in the book he still somewhat disguised this fact, and did so deliberately crudely and mockingly towards those who might suspect him of anything. Here, take it on. Take a look. In the title, he indicated that all the contents of the book were heard by a certain Nolanetz, that is, someone born in the city of Nola, and usually Giordano referred to himself as Nolanetz. However, in the book, he quite often quotes the verses of a certain Tansel, and these verses of Tansel are actually quoted by the gods themselves at the gathering. So who is he? And this is none other than Luigi Tensila, a fellow countryman of Giordano. Bruno is also from Nola, also a writer. And by the time Giordano's book was being written, he had already been dead for 20 years. So, formally, he was in heaven and could very well have heard all of this. That's Giordano's excuse. But if you dig even deeper, Luigi Tensila only has a few books, and the first one doesn't represent any philosophy at all. It's just an erotic book for bored commoners, with such explicit verses that you could easily be sent to prison for it. In any case, the church immediately banned it, and that's why Luigi had to urgently write another one, Tears of St. Peter. But Giordano constantly inserts quotes specifically from this frivolous book, and even reworks them in his own way. So the book itself is not of decisive importance, nor is the author, Luigi Tensila, himself. But what matters is the title of this book, Vendemmiator, which means a vintner, a grape harvester, a reaper, which in turn leads us to the mention of the grape harvester Vendemmiator. In the Bible, let's not forget that Giordano was a priest and knew the Bible almost by heart. And indeed, there are several mentions of Vendemmiator in the Bible. For example, the book of the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 6, verse 9. Thus says the Lord Sabaoth, they will glean the remnant of Israel as thoroughly as a vine. Pass your hand over the branches again, like a grape gatherer filling baskets. Or the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verse 1. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. That is, Vendemmiator. That is, Giordano actually said that he is the vine, meaning he is the messenger of the vine dresser, that is, of God. In fact, the second Messiah, or Antichrist, depending on your perspective. And in this case, Luigi Tensila is just a deliberately brazen excuse. Here, for example, is how he introduced himself to the rector and professors of Oxford when they invited him. I, Filate, friend of God, and Ordon Bruno Nalansky. It's understandable that the Roman Catholic Church was terribly frightened by yet another competitor, and if there was nothing it could do about the Lutherans and Calvinists, because then it would have had to fight much stronger opposing countries. But with a lone individual, even if he was the avatar of yet another god, it could be dealt with. This is also confirmed by Giordano's last words before the sentence. You are more afraid to read me this sentence than I am to hear it. And indeed, after the burning, the Roman Church fell completely silent. For 250 years, everyone remained silent about Bruno's execution, as if under the fear of death. And only later did separate drops of truth begin to come to light, mixed with tons of lies and corrections. In general, how can you be afraid for centuries of someone you destroyed and whose memory you erased long ago? No way, unless there is some immortal force with monstrous power standing behind that person. And now let's recall a couple more inconsistencies. In Venice, Bruno stated under oath that his birth name was Giordano. Later, he said that his birth name was Filippa. After his arrest in Venice, he spent 8 years in prison. However, the inquisitor in Rome stated that he had been in prison for 12 years. In the Roman Aviz, That is, in the pamphlets of those days, it was written that Bruno lived in Geneva, not for 2 months, but for 2 years. Before his execution, Giordano Bruno wrote a memorandum, which he sent to the court. The court demonstratively unsealed this memorandum, but did not read it. This is documented, yes. Maybe we're talking about different people? Maybe the Inquisition was really afraid to kill him? Here, take a look. In the text of the final sentence from February 8th, 1600, it is written, "You must be handed over to the secular court, and therefore we hand you over to the court of Monsignor, the governor of Rome, who is present here so that he may punish you, deserving of execution. Moreover, we earnestly pray that, if it pleases him, he may mitigate the severity of the laws concerning the execution upon your person, and that it may be carried out without danger of death or mutilation." In the next paragraph, the inquisitors repeat that the punishment must be carried out without bloodshed. That is, the church washed its hands, pretending that it had nothing to do with it. It simply demanded punishment without death or bloodshed. The city authorities, not the church, generally carried out executions. Then why was he killed? It's very simple. He supposedly wanted to be burned in written form. Where is this letter? Did it get lost along with the Roman interrogation protocols? Maybe they really burned not him, but another person? And now let's look at the date of the burning. He was burned on February 17th, 1600. But what if this is also a lie? Well, just think about it yourself. Such a date, 1600, a new century. Everyone is celebrating the arrival of the new century. Let's not forget, this is Europe, and that calendar is already in use there. But how could they not mark this event in a big way? Remember, at the very beginning, I said that for a long time, the Roman authorities in the Vatican claimed that it wasn't Giordano himself who was burned, but his effigy. I don't know how things were back then, but we know from the surviving records about the execution that the execution was scheduled twice. The first time it was set for February 12th, but then, for unknown reasons, it was postponed to February 17th. In the Russian magazine Semernaya Illustratia, which was published since 1869, there are repeated mentions year after year that Maslenitsa is celebrated in Europe. In Germany, in Spain, in Italy, everywhere. Moreover, in the century before last, it was believed that the Maslenitsa holiday itself came to us from there, from Europe. Supposedly, these are echoes of the Roman Saturnalia. And I decided to calculate when exactly was Maslenitsa celebrated in the year 1600. Calculating it isn't easy. You must consider the moon's phases, Jewish Passover, and days of the week. But in the end, I figured out that Maslenitsa in the year 1600 should have started on the 13th of March and ended on Sunday, the 19th of March. And if the burning of Giordano Bruno was a ritual sacrifice, then it's quite likely that it took place not on the 17th of February, but on the 19th of March, 1600. However, these are just my assumptions. But here is what is known for sure. The Catholic Church is still mortally afraid of Giordano Bruno to this day.